Imagine waking one morning to find your name carved into a stone pillar in the town square, your crime etched in permanent letters for every passerby to read, mock, and remember until the stone itself crumbles to dust. Imagine discovering that your face has been painted on the walls of public buildings, not as honor, but as eternal shame. Your features twisted into a caricature of disgrace that will outlive your body and poison the memory of your existence for generations yet unborn. This was the realm of silent punishment, a shadow justice system that operated not through the spectacle of physical torture or the finality of execution, but through the calculated destruction of human dignity, social standing, and the very possibility of redemption. These punishments whispered rather than screamed, yet their voices echoed through centuries, creating wounds that never healed and scars that passed from parent to child like inherited curses. In medieval and early modern Europe, authorities discovered that destroying a person's reputation could be more devastating than destroying their body. That social death could be more complete than physical death, and that shame could be wielded as a weapon, more precise and enduring than any sword or scaffold. The genius of silent punishment lay in its ability to turn entire communities into instruments of justice, transforming neighbors into judges, friends into executioners, and society itself into a prison from which there was no escape, no appeal, and no possibility of clemency. These were punishments that operated in the spaces between official law and unofficial justice, in the gray zones where gossip became verdict and rumor became sentence, where the accused found themselves condemned not by courts, but by the far more ruthless tribunal of public opinion, guided and shaped by authorities who understood that reputation, once destroyed, could never be fully restored. The pillory of shame stands as perhaps the most visible yet misunderstood of these silent tortures, a punishment that appeared to involve only brief public exposure, but actually created permanent social death through the systematic destruction of personal honor and community standing. Unlike the physical stocks that restrained the body for a set period, the pillory of shame was designed to restrain the soul forever, marking its victims with invisible chains that bound them to their transgression for the remainder of their lives. The condemned would be led to a public space, market square, church courtyard, or town center, where they would be secured in a wooden frame that held their head and hands immobile, while exposing their face to the assembled community. But the true punishment began not with the physical restraint, but with the ritualized humiliation that followed. The reading of charges in a voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the gathering the invitation for witnesses to come forward and testify to the condemned's moral failures, and the systematic cataloging of evidence that transformed a person from community member into cautionary tale. The crowd was not merely permitted, but encouraged to participate through verbal abuse, the throwing of refuse and the collective recitation of the condemned's crimes, creating a communal performance that bonded the community together through shared participation in the destruction of one of its members. Yet the physical ordeal, lasting hours or at most days, was merely the prelude to the true punishment, the lifelong aftermath of being known as someone who had stood in the pillory, whose name was forever associated with shame, whose presence in any social gathering carried the weight of remembered disgrace. The silent exile operated through the systematic withdrawal of social recognition, community membership, and human acknowledgement, creating a form of living death that was more complete than banishment because it occurred within the victim's own community, surrounded by people who had once been friends, neighbors, and companions. This punishment required no official decree, no legal proceeding, no formal sentence. It emerged through collective decision to treat the condemned as if they had ceased to exist, to look through them rather than at them, to speak around them rather than to them, to conduct business and social affairs as if their presence was irrelevant to community life. The victims of silent exile found themselves trapped in a paradox, physically present in their own communities, but socially absent from all meaningful human interaction, surrounded by familiar faces that no longer saw them, hearing familiar voices that no longer addressed them, living among people who had collectively agreed to treat them as ghosts haunting the edges of normal life. Shopkeepers would refuse to serve them. Neighbors would avert their eyes when they passed, former friends would cross streets to avoid encounters, and even family members might participate in the social death to protect themselves from contamination by association. The psychological impact was devastating. Victims reported feeling as if they were dissolving, becoming transparent, losing their sense of human identity through the systematic denial of social acknowledgement that forms the foundation of personal existence. The mark of Cain took many forms across different cultures and periods, but its essential function remained constant: the permanent physical marking of individuals in ways that made their transgression visible to every observer, creating walking advertisements for social boundaries and moral expectations. These marks were not temporary bruises or healing wounds, but permanent alterations to the body that would identify the condemned until death, and beyond, as even their corpses would carry the signs of their social transgression. The marks might be brands burned into the skin, tattoos carved into the flesh, deliberate scars created through systematic cutting, or the removal of body parts, fingers, ears, nose, that would make the punishment visible from a distance. In some societies, specific colors of clothing or particular styles of dress were mandated for certain categories of condemned individuals, creating visual systems that transformed everyday appearance into permanent confession of past transgressions. The genius of physical marking lay in its ability to make private sins into public knowledge, to transform hidden shame into visible warning, and to ensure that no condemned individual could ever escape the consequences of their actions through movement to new communities or the passage of time. The marks served as both punishment for the condemned and instruction for the community, teaching social boundaries through the constant presence of marked individuals who served as living reminders of the consequences of transgression. Women faced particular cruelty in marking systems, as their marks were often placed on face hands or other visible areas that would make marriage, employment, or social acceptance impossible, creating lifetime sentences to social isolation that extended the punishment far beyond any reasonable proportion to the original offense. The whispering campaign represented perhaps the most insidious form of silent punishment, as it operated through the systematic dissemination of damaging information, rumors, and allegations that destroyed reputations through the seemingly natural process of social communication. Unlike official proclamations or public accusations, whispering campaigns worked through networks of gossip that appeared spontaneous, but were actually carefully orchestrated by authorities who understood that information shared in confidence carried more credibility than information announced publicly. The process began with the strategic placement of damaging stories with key community members, merchants, tavern keepers, religious leaders, prominent housewives who were known to be central nodes in local communication networks and could be trusted to spread information throughout the community while maintaining the fiction that they were merely sharing concerns rather than participating in systematic character assassination. The stories would be crafted with enough truth to seem credible, but enough distortion to ensure maximum damage, and they would be designed to tap into existing fears, prejudices, and social tensions that would motivate people to believe and share the damaging information. The beauty of whispering campaigns lay in their deniability. No official charges were filed, no formal accusations were made, no legal proceedings were initiated, yet the condemned found their reputations systematically destroyed through a process that appeared to be nothing more than natural social communication. Victims of whispering campaigns discovered that defending themselves was impossible, as contradicting whispered allegations only seemed to confirm guilt. Demanding proof of innocence required acknowledging accusations that had never been formally made, and the source of damaging information could never be identified because it flowed through networks that obscured origins while amplifying impact. The economic strangulation operated through the systematic denial of employment, trade opportunities, and financial services that made normal life impossible, without creating obvious evidence of coordinated persecution. This punishment worked by enlisting the participation of guilds, merchants, landlords, and employers in an informal boycott that appeared to be based on individual business decisions, but was actually orchestrated to ensure that the condemned could not earn a living, secure housing, or obtain credit within their community. The victims found themselves gradually excluded from economic life through a series of seemingly unrelated events. Their employment was terminated for vague reasons, their rent was raised beyond affordable levels, Their credit was denied by lenders who offered no explanation. Their businesses lost customers who simply stopped coming without offering reasons for their departure. The punishment was designed to appear as natural market forces, rather than coordinated persecution, making it impossible for victims to identify specific acts of discrimination, while ensuring that their economic situation became desperate enough to force them into exile, crime, or complete dependence on the mercy of the very authorities who had orchestrated their destruction. Families suffered particularly under economic strangulation. As children found themselves denied apprenticeships, women discovered that their traditional sources of income had disappeared, and entire households faced destitution that appeared to result from personal failure rather than systematic persecution. The punishment was self-reinforcing, as economic desperation often led victims to engage in behaviors, begging, theft, association with criminal elements, that retroactively justified the original campaign against them and provided evidence that the community's rejection had been warranted from the beginning. The religious excommunication, in its social rather than theological dimensions, created a form of spiritual and social death that operated beyond formal church penalties to encompass the complete exclusion of individuals from the religious community that formed the foundation of medieval and early modern social life. While official excommunication removed individuals from sacramental life and formal church membership, social excommunication extended this exclusion into every aspect of community existence, as religious identity was inseparable from social identity in societies where church membership determined access to education, healthcare, business opportunities, marriage prospects, and basic social recognition. The condemned found themselves excluded, not only from religious services, but from all social activities that took place in religious contexts, festivals, markets, community meetings, educational opportunities, effectively removing them from the social life of their communities, while maintaining the fiction that they remained technically free to participate in secular activities. The punishment was particularly devastating because it appeared to be based on spiritual rather than temporal concerns, making resistance seem like rebellion against divine rather than human authority, and creating psychological frameworks where victims blamed themselves for their isolation, rather than recognizing the systematic nature of their persecution. Families of the religiously excommunicated faced impossible choices between maintaining relationships with condemned relatives and preserving their own social standing, often leading to the complete abandonment of victims by their own blood relations who feared contamination by association. The literacy shaming targeted educated individuals by systematically destroying their intellectual reputations and scholarly standing through campaigns that questioned their competence, integrity, and right to participate in learned discourse. This punishment was particularly effective against scholars, clergy, and educated professionals whose social standing depended on intellectual authority and whose livelihoods required community respect for their learning and judgment. The process involved the systematic spreading of questions about the victim's qualifications, the suggestion that their education was fraudulent or incomplete, the circulation of stories about intellectual failures or moral compromises that cast doubt on their fitness for positions requiring public trust. The punishment worked by exploiting the fact that intellectual authority, unlike inherited social status, required constant validation through community recognition, making it vulnerable to systematic undermining through coordinated campaigns of doubt and ridicule. Victims found their writings dismissed without consideration, their opinions ignored in public forums, their students and patrons gradually withdrawn from their influence, and their institutional positions gradually eliminated through bureaucratic processes that avoided direct confrontation while ensuring professional destruction. The marriage prohibition operated through informal but systematic efforts to prevent condemned individuals from forming family relationships that might restore their social standing or provide them with emotional support and economic security. This punishment recognized that marriage and family formation were crucial elements of social integration and personal identity, making their denial a particularly effective form of long-term control. The process worked through the systematic spreading of information about the condemned's moral unfitness for marriage, their unsuitability as parents, their potential danger to spouses and children, and their inability to fulfill the social and economic obligations that marriage required. Parents were warned against allowing their children to associate with the condemned. Young people were cautioned against romantic involvement with them, and community members were encouraged to intervene if relationships began to develop despite social disapproval. The punishment was self-perpetuating, as the inability to form family relationships reinforced social isolation, reduced economic opportunities, and created psychological conditions that made the condemned appear increasingly unsuitable for normal social relationships. Women faced particular cruelty under marriage prohibition systems as their economic survival and social identity were more dependent on marriage than men's, making the denial of marriage prospects a form of economic and social death sentence that could extend throughout their lifetimes. The professional destruction targeted individuals whose social identity and economic survival depended on professional reputation and community trust, systematically undermining their ability to practice their trades, professions, or crafts through coordinated campaigns that questioned their competence, integrity, and reliability. This punishment was particularly effective against physicians, lawyers, teachers, craftsmen, and merchants whose livelihoods required ongoing relationships with clients and customers who could withdraw their business based on concerns about quality, honesty, or social acceptability. The process involved the strategic placement of complaints about professional services, the circulation of stories about failed treatments, unsuccessful legal cases, or defective products, and the gradual erosion of professional networks through suggestions that association with the condemned might damage other professionals' reputations. Victims discovered that their professional licenses might be revoked for technical violations that had previously been overlooked. Their access to professional organizations and training opportunities might be restricted through bureaucratic processes, and their ability to obtain the materials, tools, and resources necessary for their work might be gradually eliminated through informal boycotts. The punishment was designed to appear as natural market consequences rather than coordinated persecution, making it difficult for victims to identify specific acts of discrimination, while ensuring that their professional destruction appeared to result from personal inadequacy rather than systematic targeting. The ancestral contamination extended punishment beyond individual victims to encompass their families, descendants, and even ancestors, creating systems of inherited shame that could persist across generations and destroy entire family lines through the systematic spread of stories about hereditary moral corruption, criminal tendencies, and social unfitness. This punishment operated on the principle that moral corruption was inheritable, that the sins of parents contaminated their children, and that entire family lines could be permanently marked by the transgressions of individual members. The process involved the systematic documentation and dissemination of information about family histories, the creation of genealogies of shame that tracked moral failures across generations, and the development of social customs that treated family background as reliable predictor of individual character and potential. Children of the condemned found themselves denied educational opportunities, marriage prospects, and employment possibilities based not on their own actions, but on the permanent stain of family association with transgression. The punishment created incentives for family members to participate in the persecution of condemned relatives, as distancing themselves from contaminated family members became necessary for protecting their own social standing and future prospects. The memory manipulation involved the systematic alteration of historical records, community memories, and social narratives to ensure that the condemned would be remembered only in terms of their transgression, that their positive contributions to community life would be erased or minimized, and that their identity would be permanently associated with shame and failure. This punishment recognized that social identity extended beyond present existence into past memory and future legacy, making the control of historical narrative a powerful tool for extending punishment beyond the lifespan of individual victims. The process involved the removal of the condemned's names from public records, the destruction or alteration of documents that recorded their positive contributions, the systematic editing of community histories to emphasize their failures while eliminating their achievements, and the creation of cautionary tales that transformed complex human beings into simple moral lessons about the consequences of transgression. Families found that their condemned relatives had been effectively erased from official memory, that their names were omitted from church records, family documents, and community chronicles, creating a form of posthumous execution that denied the condemned even the dignity of being remembered as complete human beings rather than cautionary examples. The geographic marking created invisible boundaries that restricted the condemned's movement within their own communities, establishing informal but effective systems of internal exile that limited access to specific areas, buildings, or social spaces without requiring formal banishment or legal restriction. This punishment operated through the systematic communication of expectations about where the condemned could and could not go, what areas of town were appropriate for their presence, and what spaces were reserved for community members in good standing. Victims discovered that certain streets, markets, churches, or public buildings had become effectively off-limits through the hostile reactions they encountered when attempting to enter these spaces, the refusal of others to conduct business with them in certain locations, and the systematic creation of social situations that made their presence uncomfortable or impossible. The punishment was particularly effective because it maintained the fiction that the condemned remained free to move about their community while creating practical restrictions that were more limiting than formal banishment, as victims were forced to navigate constantly shifting boundaries that could change based on the moods, whims, and political calculations of community members who collectively enforced invisible rules of exclusion. The legacy of silent punishments extends far beyond their historical context to illuminate enduring patterns of social control that operate through reputation destruction, community exclusion, and the systematic denial of social recognition and economic opportunity. Contemporary forms of public shaming, cancel culture, social media persecution, and professional destruction draw upon the same psychological and social mechanisms that made silent punishment so effective in previous eras, demonstrating the continued relevance of these historical practices for understanding modern forms of social control and community justice. The power of silent punishment lay in its ability to enlist entire communities in the enforcement of social boundaries while maintaining the fiction that punishment resulted from natural social processes rather than coordinated persecution, making resistance difficult and creating systems of control that were more effective than formal legal mechanisms because they operated through internalized shame and social pressure rather than external coercion. The psychological impact of silent punishment often proved more devastating than physical torture or execution, as victims were forced to endure ongoing social death while remaining physically present in their communities, creating forms of suffering that were invisible to outside observers, while being intensely experienced by those subjected to systematic exclusion and reputation destruction. As you contemplate these historical forms of punishment that operated through silence rather than spectacle, through exclusion rather than inclusion, through reputation destruction rather than physical violence, consider how many contemporary mechanisms of social control draw upon similar principles of community-enforced shame, systematic exclusion, and the weaponization of reputation to maintain social boundaries and punish those who transgress community expectations. The medieval and early modern practitioners of silent punishment understood that destroying a person's social identity could be more effective than destroying their body. That community participation in punishment created stronger social bonds than individual acts of violence, and that shame, once properly deployed, could create systems of self-policing that made external enforcement largely unnecessary. These historical practices reveal the sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that made silent punishment such an effective tool of social control, while also illuminating the continuing vulnerability of human beings to forms of persecution that operate through social exclusion rather than physical violence. If this exploration of history's most insidious forms of punishment has revealed patterns of social control that extend beyond medieval practices into contemporary experience, share your insights. Subscribe for more investigations into the hidden mechanisms of social power And remember that understanding historical forms of persecution provides crucial knowledge for recognizing and resisting similar patterns in modern contexts. Would you have recognized the systematic nature of silent punishment while living under its influence, or would you have accepted the fiction that social exclusion and reputation destruction resulted from natural social processes rather than coordinated campaigns of persecution designed to maintain power and enforce conformity?